Good morning. Go ahead and turn to 2 Kings chapter 2. We are continuing our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. Well, it's not so much Elijah anymore. We're kind of past that point. I'll do a quick review on that in just a second. While I'm getting my notes up here. Maybe say a quick prayer for Bethany. I think she's got more people than she expected to have for class this morning, so hopefully she can make it out alive. I'd be very sad if that wasn't the case. So last week we we went away from 2 Kings chapter 2 a little bit just to talk about Elijah as far as his significance being not just who he was as a prophet in his own time, but how the Bible looks at him and uses him after that point. We looked at Malachi, talking about the forecoming of the Elijah that would be sent to the people. And of course, in Jesus' day, they were looking for this Elijah. And of course, we read through several verses that indicate that John the Baptist was that promised Elijah who was going to go forth, prepare the way of the Lord, bring the hearts of the people back. And, there's also a couple other instances where Elijah is mentioned. It talks about his faithfulness in James chapter 5 and how his faithfulness and his prayer did things that we actually read about in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. And also we talked a little bit about his parallel with Moses. Elijah and Moses are often paired together in kind of unusual places, if you will, in the Bible. Notably, the Transfiguration is the most obvious. And then also Revelation chapter 11 seems to indicate both of them there as the two witnesses of God. So I thought it was a good idea for us to kind of back up and take stock of Elijah more than just his time as far as the prophet on earth, but to see how the Bible really looked at him after that point. But we concluded that. I don't really have any more to say, so we're going to get back to 2 Kings chapter 2. And we're going to continue with kind of the narrative of the kings here, if you will. But we're not really going to see Elijah anymore. He will be mentioned a couple times, basically to talk about Elisha. They're like, oh yeah, Elisha's here. The one that, was serving Elijah back in the day. He's here now. That's basically it. We're not going to talk about Elijah really anymore. Elisha is the guy. He is the prophet that they're going to be turning to now at this point in time for this next generation post Ahab, if you will. That's probably the easiest way to look at the kings is after Ahab, then you have 2 Kings and the generations that come after Ahab. So it's interesting how those kind of go together. So with that, let's get back into 2 Kings chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 19. That's where we'll pick up. Before we read through that, just a quick background here. Remember, after Elijah was taken up into heaven, was no longer found on the earth, Elisha seemed to have gone back with the company of prophets that had followed them to the Jordan. And as far as I understand, those prophets were from Jericho. And it seems that he has gone back to Jericho with them. And that's where he is when we pick up here in verse 19. I think he's still there at Jericho. We're not told that he's moved out of that location yet. Because verse 18 indicates that he is in Jericho. He was staying there. And we pick up in verse 19. It seems that he is still there. So I think this is kind of all one flow. Even though a lot of your publications will put a break there between verses 18 and 19, I think this is really just a continuation of the same story. So just want to put that there so we kind of know where we are. So I'm going to read for us 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 19 through 22, please. 19 through 22. Okay, so kind of before we get into the details of this here, a lot of what we're going to see of Elisha is doing a whole bunch of little things that seem maybe inconsequential to us, but were probably really important to the people he helped, which is almost seemingly somewhat opposite of what Elijah does. Elijah does a few really big things that everyone sees and, they're amazing. And Elisha just does these little things that are miraculous, but yet not have this grand scale like we see a lot of times with Elijah. So just kind of keep that in mind. He's doing a little bit of a different work, even though he is continuing the work that Elijah had done, and we kind of talked about that last week also. So we're picking up here in verse 19. Like I said, Elisha, I believe he is still in Jericho here. So when we talk about the city and the people of the city, I believe we're talking about Jericho. That's my understanding. I'm not told it anywhere else. I don't see that indication that we're moving on somewhere else yet. And they come to him and they say, basically, there's something wrong with the water. It's not that there's a lack of water. Is that the water they have is, translations will say something like they're bad or it's unproductive or there's something wrong with the water. And any of you who have had really bad water before kind of may understand what that is. I lived in Indiana for a couple years up in Lafayette, and they get their water from the Wabash River, which is not a nice looking river at all. It's not like clear water or anything. I one time saw a person kayaking, and I'm like, why are they ever going to that? Anyway, and the water was terrible. I mean, you had floaty junk in it. It was the worst tasting water ever. So I kind of imagine this is probably worse than that, but basically they're not able to use it. It's not good for the land. It's not good for them. This water it's no good. So Elisha, I'm going to try to not do that. Elisha, he asks for a new bowl with some salt in it. And of course they grant that request. And they're like, okay, here's your bowl with salt. And he goes out to the spring and he throws in the salt and he says, the Lord has healed this water. It's never going to go bad again. Verse 22 states that the water of the spring remained good. It's not like it was a temporary thing. It's remained good past his time. So it's all fixed. Great. This seems like sort of an inconsequential, not really important story that they've just put in here. And it's kind of interesting. I looked this up, and I'm not a scientist. My wife is the one who does this stuff. So I only have the capabilities of what Google can tell me. But salt does have properties that can help with water purification. It's called solar disinfection method, which I don't really know how it all works scientifically. I can't explain that to you. But basically, if you have some murky water and you add some salt to it, it helps to separate like the clay and the dirt from the water, essentially. Now, that sounds like, okay, Elisha's just a really good scientist and he knows that adding salt to this water fixes it. This is no big deal. Well, see, the thing is that would only work for a certain amount of time. You would have to go back again and again and have to redo this process. Salt would have not been like the most expensive thing, but salt was not as cheap as it is now. It's not as readily available as it is now. They would have had to keep going back and doing it again and again. But Elisha says, one time, it's good now. You're not going to have to worry about it again. And again, verse 22 says, this was so. It never went bad again. It remained good until this day. So that's really interesting. So it almost seems like he's using something that seems like a natural, very typical thing that one could do, but there is still a miracle in there because it remained that way. It was not just a temporary fixing of the spring water. So, you may think this, again, seems very inconsequential, but this is Jericho. Jericho is not a minor city. And remember, before, in the time of Elijah, there was 3.5 years of drought in the northern kingdom of Israel. Water is probably still not a source that everyone is, okay with losing for a little while because they've seen how bad it gets. I mean, we talked about quite extensively the damage that the northern kingdom of Israel received from having that lack of water. And in fact, chapter 3, this is going to come up again, the issue of water. I think I saw a hand up. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, and I get that feeling too, that he would have had to put in a lot more salt for this to have been effective in any way. Of course, I say a bowl. We don't know how big the bowl was, but certainly it was something he could have carried himself. That's the description we get. He would have had to probably get barrels and barrels of this stuff if we're talking about, an area of Jericho, and it would have been the surrounding fields as well, not just the city itself, because it does talk about, this water is not even good for using on crops. There's something in it, and we're not given the description enough to know exactly what the problem was, which, I suppose it doesn't really matter because Elisha fixes it. But natural or, miraculous, I think this leans on the side of miraculous because even with a natural explanation, it does not reach the scope and the time period of which that would have been required. So those that would say, well, yeah, just Elisha knows his stuff as far as science goes. No, and I don't think they would have had that understanding necessarily. They were smart people, but I don't think they would have been able to do it as it's described here. It certainly is a miraculous instance. So that's sort of Elisha's, I guess it's not his first miraculous thing he does because he does cross the Jordan back when he leaves, or when Elijah leaves him, but this is kind of the first thing he does for the people, in this case of Judah. He's going to go back to Israel. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Any further comments, questions on this section of 2 Kings chapter 2? Just kind of a little nice story about Elisha doing something. Again, showing that, God is with him. The prophets of Jericho said this earlier when he crossed the Jordan River back to them. They said the spirit of Elijah is upon Elisha. So they recognize it. Now the people of the city recognize it. So maybe this is him just kind of showing that, yeah, God's with me, or I don't know. It's an interesting inclusion here, this story. So, all right, if nothing else, we'll continue on to the next story in 2 Kings chapter 2. This will wrap it up as far as this chapter. So I'm going to read for us verses 23 through 25, please. 23 through 25. Okay. This is a fun little story. There's nothing quite else like it in Scripture. And it seems really odd, but I think as we kind of dig into the details a little bit, we'll see like some of this is actually pretty consistent with what we would see. It's just kind of how it unfolds is a little bit different. But we see Elisha, I'm going to do that again. I got to stop. Elisha, he's leaving Jericho. And it says he is on his way to Bethel. Now, if those are just cities to you and that means nothing, there is a detail here that is important. When he's leaving Jericho, he is in the kingdom of Judah. He goes to Bethel. He is now in the northern kingdom of Israel. He is changing jurisdictions here. He's crossing borders. So keep that in mind. I'm going to talk about why that's important in just a second. But there is an importance there. He's no longer in Judah. He's now back up in Israel. So Elisha, he's traveling up the road, and some young men or boys, depending on your translation, youth, they come out of the city, and I believe when it says the city, I believe we're talking about Bethel in this case. I think that's the implication here. The youth, they come out of Bethel, and they yell at him. They say, "Go up, you bald head. Get out of here, baldy. Ha, you're bald." As youth do, I guess. I don't know. It seems like an interesting insult to choose. Of course, we only get so much information, again, about how this went down. But if you remember to 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah first goes to basically recruit Elisha to go with him, Elisha is already a grown man. He's already well established. And he's got his own farm operation that he's working on when Elijah shows up. He is not some kid he just picked up somewhere. He is a grown man. He's probably much older now. He may, be losing it somewhere. 1 in 3 men will develop some sort of male pattern baldness, and he's just that 1/3 perhaps. I don't doubt that maybe he's gotten older and he may be bald. That may be true. I don't doubt that as being a fact. But of course, this is said with malice, is, making fun, saying, look at this guy, and they're saying, go up or get out or go away. Basically, he's not welcome there. These kind of young men or these youth are doing something extremely disrespectful to, just an older person in general. That would not have been an okay thing to do in those times, in that culture. You would not do that. but also he's a prophet of God here. So you really don't want to disrespect him because he kind of speaks for God in many instances. So that's a dangerous thing to do. Extremely disrespectful to kind of, cast insults upon a messenger of God. Not a good idea. It never goes well for anybody. So you kind of think about it that way. And when Elisha calls down this curse upon them, it seems like, oh yeah, okay, that seems to be kind of a inline response with a lot of other instances we see when prophets of God are not heard or ignored or persecuted in any way. Stuff like that did happen. Just in this case, it's the bears. But before we even get to the details of that, I want to talk about these young men of the city of Bethel, and kind of we need to consider Elisha's reputation here as he's coming toward Bethel. Bethel's a city, like I said, under the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you remember back about Elijah, was he well liked by the monarchy of Israel? Was he a friend of the king and the queen? No. He was very much the opposite of that. He was an enemy of the state. If you go back and you look at the details of chapter 17 and 18, he was running for his life, and especially in chapter 19, he is an enemy of the state. They're looking for him actively to try to kill him. Elijah was not a friend of the monarchy. That bloodline is still in effect. Even though Ahab is not around, his son, he's going to have another son here. We talked about the one that died, but he's going to have another son on the throne. Ahab's family is still in possession of that throne. So if you think about that, and then you have Elisha, who was a known servant and attendant to Elijah, went everywhere with him after chapter 19 of 1 Kings. You start to see that people are connecting the dots that, hey, we don't like this Elijah guy. He's all these problems in Israel. In fact, that's always how Ahab called Elijah. He said, oh, you're my enemy. You're the trouble of Israel, even though, the real funny thing is Ahab was the problem. But he put all his problems and said, this is Elijah's fault. He's doing all these things to us, not looking at his own faults and his problems. But that's the mindset of the people. And now they see Elisha, his kind of apprentice, who's kind of come back up into Israel, and they're saying, well, we don't want this guy. Get out of here, you bald head. Why that's the insult they chose, I don't know. But that kind of makes sense as why they're acting this way toward Elisha. I can kind of see why this is how the youth of the city would greet him, if you will. But Elisha calls down a curse on them. We have 2 bears emerge from the woods. They maul 42 of the young men. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had bear encounters before, or know anything about bear hunting or anything like that. And I believe the translation I was read was she bears or female bears. Not all translations will have that detail. But one thing you really don't want to do is get in the way of a mama bear and her cubs. You are going to die. That's just how it's going to be. Like that's how you don't have to really do anything. You just have to be there, and they will take you out. But of course, no cubs are mentioned here, so I'm not exactly sure if we could call this natural, because it seems that Elisha's curse seems to be the cause of this, not that they just happen to be in the vicinity. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we can naturally explain this. And kills 42, which 21 apiece. That's even a lot for a bear. Bears are not going to go on these killing sprees. They will hunt for food, and they will eat what they need. They don't go out and find, a whole herd of deer and say, I'm going to get like 15 of these and I'll save them for later. They get one, they eat it, and then when they're hungry again, they go to the next one. They're not going to be hunting huge packs of them like that. So this is not a typical thing that bears would do. And in fact, if you come upon bears most of the time, unless it's, a mama bear and her cubs, most of the time they're just kind of going to ignore you, or they're going to go away. Most of them don't like encounters with people. I've seen bears in person in the wilderness. They're usually not a problem, except in certain instances. So this is definitely, again, not a natural phenomenon. This is pretty intense as far as these bears go. Moving on from that, the one interesting thing I think is maybe most important is actually verse 25, which gives us maybe the least detail of all the things I would want to know, because remember, he's going up from Jericho, he's moving north to Bethel, and then it says he goes to Mount Carmel. Now, why does he go there? I don't know. I really don't know. And it doesn't tell us why he went there, or any details about his travel there. It just says he went to Mount Carmel. Now, we can go back and look at 1 Kings chapter 18 and say, well, there was this huge showdown back on Mount Carmel with Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. But I don't know of any direct tie between that instance and this, why he's going there necessarily. Obviously, he's going there probably because God told him to, but we don't know why God would have told him to do that. We're not given any detail about that. But why that's interesting, not just that he goes to Mount Carmel, but then he goes to Samaria. Now, again, if you don't know geography, those are just names to you. He would have had to go either around or past Samaria to get to Mount Carmel. So if Samaria was his final destination, he's gone way out of his way to go up to Mount Carmel and then come back down to Samaria. Again, we don't get any information about why he does this, what he does when he's doing that. We get the story about the bears around Bethel, and that's about it. But I like to kind of talk about how much traveling, we talked about this with Elijah, how much traveling he's doing across not just Israel and Judah, but outside of it. And Elisha is doing kind of a similar thing. He's going on sort of this tour. Again, we don't know what he did, why he went to those places. But it's not like he's sitting in one place. He is definitely moving around. We're going to see him come up in chapter 3 too, and he just happens to be in a really odd location. God sends his people where he needs them, and we don't always get the details about why they're there, but he's not there for no reason. That's going to be as far as I can go with that. He's not at Mount Carmel for no reason. We just don't know what that reason is. It's not like he got lost trying to go to Samaria and he didn't know where he was going, and he got to Mount Carmel. He's like, oh, whoops, I've gone too far. I need to turn around. I think he would have figured it out long before then. So if someone ever has that idea, is just they're wandering around not sure where they're going, I don't think it's that. I think it's he had some sort of mission or something that God probably wanted him to do. That's why he went there. We just don't know what that is. And a lot of times we may get frustrated because we don't know the details we want. We have what we need. I'm not going to say God messed up here in the text. We're just not told that information, and I've got to be okay with that. So you know how I am with details, but that's as far as I can go. So if you have any questions about verse 25, I've given you everything I know. Any other comments, thoughts about this interesting story of bears? I wasn't going to try to say too much. Even Jeff's not here, so I can only make fun of so many people at one time. But yeah, it's a weird. Of all the things they could have chosen, they could have said like, oh, this is some prophet or whatever. He thinks he's so good. He thinks the Lord speaks through him. They comment on his physical appearance of baldness, which is not really seen anywhere else in Scripture. It's a really weird insult. Maybe they stopped doing it after that. They said, oh, okay, this is the thing we don't make fun of people over. I don't know. Just an odd thing. I don't know. It seems sort of like a modern thing that would happen, but it shows you how little people have really changed over the years as far as how witty we are, I guess. Any other thoughts, comments on chapter 2? Go ahead, as long as we know it's speculation. Mm-hmm.
That may be, again, speculation. It could be a point of him gaining some encouragement from his mentor that's now gone. Of the scene that goes there. Now I'm laying my eyes on this thing that I wasn't a part of. So there could be some significance in that sense that you can gain perspective even though you weren't there for that thing. I would never let it, but I'd love to go see the memorial.
Mm. Yeah, that is an interesting thought, and I've kind of thought about that as sort of a possibility. We do know that Elisha was not there. As far as we know, he was not yet serving under Elijah yet. That happens in the following chapter. So he's a chapter too late to see it in person. In fact, we talked quite a bit about that. Elijah had another servant, and we talked about him and where did this guy come from, and it didn't seem to really be that important after his role was done. But yeah, it's a possibility, or maybe God sent him there to have some sort of time to himself, perhaps. Get away from these youth of Bethel for a while. We've had a little encounter here. We need to have some time to calm and not have the conflict as much as possible before going back to Samaria. Because what is the significance of Samaria? Does anyone remember? Samaria is a very important town in Israel because, so the temple of Baal that Ahab built was in Samaria. Samaria basically became the kind of de facto capital of Israel during the reign of Omri, Ahab's father. Before that, I think it had been Tirzah was what they were using as sort of their capital. Then he established it in Samaria. We do know that Ahab did also have a royal palace in Jezreel also, which would actually be closer to Mount Carmel. We talked about Jezreel quite a bit. We'll talk about Jezreel a little more, and we'll get there. But Samaria sort of is the de facto capital. And after the reign of Ahab's family, after they're kind of wiped aside, Samaria is going to be pretty much the capital. Jezreel's not going to have that same significance anymore. And then when we see in the prophets, when they speak of curses against Samaria and things like that, he's meaning the northern kingdom of Israel. That's the capital. It would have been the same if God was saying bad things about Jerusalem, he's talking about Judah. That's the capital. Or if he's saying bad things about Damascus, that's talking about Syria or the people of Aram, whichever translation or whichever word your translation uses. So that's the kind of language you're saying here. So Samaria is extremely important. It is the epicenter of all evil basically going on in Israel. It's the capital of the kingdom. It is the place where the temple of Baal is. That's going to come up again later in our study, what happens to that temple and the people in it. So there's a lot of really bad things going on. So again, maybe that is a reason he goes up to Mount Carmel, have a little breather before going on to Samaria. Go ahead, Arnold. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and we can never really know because we're not always told, what the internal feelings of people in the time are or what they're thinking. So again, we do have to kind of have these suppositions and kind of wonder a little bit. We'll never really know for sure, but it's kind of a neat exercise to kind of think about why. But again, we don't really know for sure. So I'm just going to say as much as the scripture says on that. We don't really know, but that is an interesting detail. He's traveling. I mean, he's moving around. Again, in chapter 3, we're going to see him show up in another place where it's like, oh, Elisha's here. Okay. He had to walk quite a ways to get here, but here he is. So we might get into that in just a second. Any further comments, questions, thoughts? Chapter 2, 2 Kings. All right, we got a little bit of time still, so let's at least start chapter 3. We will not finish. Chapter 3 will probably take a couple of weeks at least, but we can start it and kind of dig into the background. Someone read for us 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. 1 through 5, please. Okay, right there. That's good. So this is kind of going to be our setup for the events of chapter 3. So this would be a good place for us to kind of dig in a little bit, and we'll get into the details next week. But certainly this will be a good place for us to kind of end off. Now, the beginning of this chapter is really talking about the new king of the northern kingdom of Israel, King Joram. Some of your translations will say Jehoram or have like a footnote that says, you could also be Jehoram. It's a variant of the same name. So whatever your translation uses, just know that's the guy we're talking about. My translation uses Joram, so I'm going to say Joram. But if yours says Jehoram, it's not wrong. It's just the same guy, just different variant of the name. So we're going to talk about him and his actions here. Now remember, Ahab died at the end of 1 Kings. We went into that detail quite a bit. He died, and in 2 Kings chapter 1, we had Ahab's son Ahaziah take the throne. He also died. I mean, he reigned, 2 years? It was a really insignificant reign. Nothing really happened except he died. But Ahaziah, we're told also in that chapter, he did not have any sons. So none of his sons could inherit the kingdom, couldn't inherit the throne because he didn't have any. So what happened was his brother Joram took control of the kingdom of Israel. So when you think about it, Joram, like Ahaziah, is also a son of Ahab. He's probably just the second-born son. He wouldn't have been the oldest son. So basically, he would not have become king ever unless his brother had died. So it kind of makes you wonder, did Joram push him through that lattice structure on that second story? You don't really know. We're not told any of that detail, but it makes you wonder suddenly because he was not going to be king. I mean, he pulls a scar here. He kills his brother to inherit the throne, if you will. So we don't know that. That's entirely not in the text at all. I'm just saying that people would think that perhaps because he was not slated to be on the throne. But now he is. And he became king of Israel during Jehoshaphat's 18th year as the kingdom of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. We've talked about Jehoshaphat already. He's going to be involved in this story quite a bit. Jehoshaphat was considered a good king for the most part. He made some unwise decisions. But interestingly, here in this section of Kings and earlier in 1 Kings, he does some pretty smart things. Like he says, hey, can we consult God about this? That seems to be the best thing he ever does, even though he doesn't always listen to what he's told, which is this weird thing that he does. But of course, we know that Jehoshaphat's tie here with Ahab's family is one of marriage. Jehoshaphat's son married Ahab's daughter, and I forget what week it was, I kind of drew up a little genealogy there about how they're together and how it becomes a big problem in Judah later on. We're not there yet, but we're going to get there before the end of this study where suddenly the daughter of, I'm going to call it the daughter of Jezebel because she acts just like Jezebel, does some pretty bad things on a throne that she should not have. We'll get there. Anyway, but that's why Jehoshaphat is mentioned here, and also he's going to be involved later in this chapter with Joram. They are allied together by marriage. So basically, anything the kingdom of Israel wants to do, Judah's going along with them, which doesn't sound bad, except for Israel is ruled by a very evil monarchy at this time. In fact, when you go and you see how it describes Joram, it says he was an evil king in the eyes of the Lord, but he wasn't quite as bad as Ahab and Jezebel, which is the most terrible insult to Ahab and Jezebel, because you remember as we were at the beginning of the study, we were looking at the kings leading up to Ahab. It said about his father, Omri, that he was the most evil king of Israel that had ever been seen. And then he dies, and then his son Ahab becomes king. It says he was even more evil than Omri. So he was the worst king. And of course, later on in 1 Kings, when it's talking about kind of the conclusion of his life, it said he was the most evil king that had ever reigned in Israel. And then we get here to chapter 3 of 2 Kings, and that confirms it again that Ahab was the most evil king because his son was not quite as bad. Still bad, but not quite as bad. He did this one thing where he got rid of the stone of Baal, the sacred stone, but he did not completely go away from idolatry. It says here that he followed after the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which is almost always a description of every single king in Israel. Remember when Jeroboam took over the northern 10 tribes, he was afraid that the people would turn back to God and they would want to go back to Rehoboam, to the king of Judah. And he said, well, I got to keep people from going down to Jerusalem to pray, to worship God. So I'm going to set up these idols in Dan and Bethel, and that's going to make everything okay. We'll set up these golden calves, they'll worship them, and I'll keep the hearts of the people. Well, of course, that introduces state-funded idolatry here, and then every single king after that has the same problem. including Joram here. He has the same problem with idolatry. Not quite as bad as Ahab, but still not good. Still bad. So he's not a good king. That's just plain and simple. He's not as bad as Ahab, but he's still a bad king. And then the text turns to talking about the nation of Moab. This I'm going to have to quickly get through this. We won't turn to this for the second time, but 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 12, talks about the nations that David, during his reign, subdued. Moab was one of them. And from that point onward, it seems that Moab was in constant subjugation to Israel, even in the divided kingdom time, up until Ahab died. In fact, if you remember back to 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 1, the first thing it says is after the death of Ahab, Moab revolted. Now, who was king at the time in Israel? It wasn't Joram, it was his older brother Ahaziah. And of course, Ahaziah was too busy falling out of his lattice work and dying to do anything about this rebellion. But so now it's Joram's problem. He's got to take over and figure out, okay, now what are we going to do with this rebellion in Moab? That, these people that have been paying tribute to us in lambs and wool, suddenly they're not going to do that anymore. They're going to, push off any power we have over them. I got to go back and I got to, seal this up. I need to put them back under our thumb. And so that's what he's going to want to do in this chapter. So again, this is now Joram's problem because his brother didn't do anything about it. Like I said, he was too busy falling and dying. And so now we're going to see, and we're not going to get it today, but because we're out of time, but this chapter is going to be about how Joram goes and subdues Moab again. But he's not going to be alone. I'm going to give you, if you haven't already read the chapter, which I think I told you guys to, Judah's going to be involved, and also Edom is going to be involved. We're going to have a really interesting alliance of armies here, but they'll have really different ideas, it seems, about what they should be doing. But we'll get to that. It's going to feel familiar to those of you who remember Ahab and Jehoshaphat going to try to take a certain city from the people of Aram. We're going to see some very similar themes and things said. So, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. But we're going to stop there. We're out of time. So next week we'll pick up in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 6. We'll see kind of what Joram does and how his coalition goes about dealing with the Moabites. We're going to get some interesting details about warfare logistics, which we'll go through in detail because, I can't help myself. I don't know if we'll finish chapter 3, but if you haven't already, go ahead and read chapter 3 so you kind of know what's going to be coming up. And we'll probably not get any farther than that next week. So we'll stop there. I appreciate all your comments and questions.